Let's have a look at two techniques, or rather targets, which can be used when you're punching, and if they're ever talked about, I've not seen it, and I think they're worth giving consideration to. Here goes. My attention was drawn to these the first time I went to train in Muay Thai. That was in 2006, and it was the first time I'd been training with people who were used to fighting on a regular basis, even if it was just at the club, not necessarily in a ring. And the instructor there, not there anymore unfortunately, he was pretty good. He was also very well trained in jiu-jitsu, and he had experience. He worked as a doorman. He definitely knew how to fight, what worked and what didn't work. First time I went there, he spent a good hour showing me some things specific to Muay Thai, a lot of general things, blocking, moving, but also, when I say blocking, I mean with the legs. I had no idea about that before. But also some ways you could apply Muay Thai. And one of the things he mentioned to me was punching somebody on the shoulder. If they're keeping their guard up consistently and you can't get around the guard, then just make an attack straight onto the shoulder. That will soon discourage them, soon make it more difficult for them to keep their guard up. And the other one was punch to the chest. He actually, before demonstrating it, asked me if I have asthma or anything like that. I told him I did, but it doesn't really cause a problem. And he gave me a moderate power punch on the chest. And even that was enough for me to notice that it does have an effect on you. It is something, other than trying to seek a knockout, that is going to really deter somebody if they're aggressive towards you. The chest punching, I have actually seen one video where a person talks about punching in the chest, boxer, and he's actually talking about when somebody's constantly moving the head around, and if you find you're missing all the time, then you could just aim for the centre instead. It sounds like a good idea to me, and you might catch them as they're moving off. And certainly it's something that's very good for boxing and combat sports, but if you're spending all your time aiming for the head, I don't think that's what you want to do in self-defence. You're reducing the likelihood of you doing something effective. And of course, if you've got somebody who's really effectively moving the head around all the time outside the boxing ring, you just want to grab hold of them. And who's interested in combat sports wouldn't love to see a good grappler get hold of Floyd Mayweather? I most certainly would. That would soon show him a difference between combat and boxing. Those simple techniques, of course. Now let's just, before I lose the light, let's just get into it very quickly. Try to position this correctly. So of course, in the standard stance, somebody's chest is this way and their left shoulder's opposite your jabbing hand. And a lot of the time, especially if they do have a mind to defending their head, then they're not going to react so well. They're not as likely to move because they think they're defended here if you just start jabbing at the shoulder. And there's only so many it's going to take until it really starts to weaken a bit and discourage them, or perhaps just distract them until you try another attack. What I think would be effective, I haven't done this fighting somebody, not even semi-contact. I think it could be good to feint, real swift feint to the head with the left. Then they're going to move their head a bit, perhaps move back, and still leave the shoulder closer to you for attack. And you could just do that and get a hard one in on the shoulder. They're probably going to think, what the hell's he doing? And it'll only be after a couple of hits doing that they start to really feel the effect. When people were in school, in Britain at least, they used to call it giving your friend or your enemy a dead arm by hitting them repeatedly on the arm. Not that hard really. You've got lots of nerves around the shoulder. I think that's what it's having the effect on. Of course, this is different if you're wearing gloves, because I'm not one of those people who thinks that gloves are to protect the person being attacked. I realise, if anything, the opposite is true. But when you're hitting people with knuckles, it's a very different matter, and you're far more likely to have a nasty impact, squeeze a nerve and do something to it. Although you have to be more careful about placing punches and where you punch and when you punch when you're not wearing gloves. But it is a very different matter, and we see, of course, in bare knuckle boxing, when you do get it televised, I've not seen a lot of it, you get a lot more cuts for very good reasons, because you're having a much smaller surface impact with the skin, much more likely to cut it, much more likely to cause nerve damage. Not easy to keep this thing still. So it's simple as that, really. You're aiming for the shoulder as much as you can, much of the point being they're keeping their guard up, keeping their chin low, and they're not so likely to try to evade when you're hitting their shoulder, not even going to think about it very much, but that's going to mount up after a while. Of course, this only applies if it's somebody who is facing you in a boxing manner, and it is quite well known that a hell of a lot of fights out on the street end up on the floor very quickly. Obviously it's because people don't really know how to fight, don't know how to get into a rhythm and defend themselves and work on an opponent's defence, so they just, and it is instinctive. If something's coming at you and you can't get away, you just grab hold of it, stop those arms flailing at you. It doesn't really apply so much then unless you push them away again, but you do get a fair lot of people, you see it in videos all the time, they square off and they're ready to fight, and you could have circumstances where giving somebody a few, especially if you are trained and you punch pretty hard and they don't, then giving them a few really hard punches in the shoulder, that would do you really well in a court of law as defence. Say, well, Your Honour, I thought I might dissuade him from fighting me, and it's a lot better than hitting somebody in the face. That would be very difficult to argue with. Not saying it's always going to work. Sometimes you make somebody angry and they're just going to come at you all the more, but it's certainly something worth considering, especially when you get that point where you're not quite sure what's going to happen and people are squared off, and sometimes people want a way out of it, and you might even find if they're punched in the face, that's it, they're angry, they're really affronted, I've got to do something now, where a punch in the shoulder, what's going on here, might leave a little bit more leeway for diffusing the situation. Not saying it always would, but it's something else worth keeping in mind. But mainly the point is that their shoulder's facing you, they're not going to move it out of the way as much as they would their head, and you're not taking as much of a risk, because of course when you do body blows, then your guard is relaxed down however quickly, and not so much if you're doing that, feinting the punch, then it's very quick, you can have an impact, and if you do end up squaring off in the position with guards, then you wear away at it, and before long they're going to find their arm really isn't so fit for punching and they start to lower their guard. Another way potentially to dissuade them without the combat going too far. And the other one, a little bit more difficult to get into, is of course hitting the chest, and this needs power as much as you can get, and of course it is a little bit more dangerous, but a lot of the time in self-defense you are defending yourself and you've got no choice. This isn't something I'm thinking about in the ring, although I don't know, there's not a lot that you can't do in the ring, and I'm not aware of anything preventing you from doing this in any set of rules where there's full contact. A lot of the time they're still in the same guard, so it's not going to be so open. If you've got somebody standing at you like this, then it's a different matter, and if somebody's standing at you like this, like some kind of a football hooligan, maybe they deserve a really square punch straight in the chest, maybe they do. And again, it might be a better idea than in the face if you're not going to knock somebody out, and I don't think you need anything near 100% power. I've surmised 70% power. It depends on the person, depends on your weight and your strength, but it's not that I think it's all that difficult necessarily to knock somebody out. I've become really wobbly before now just from holding the pads and not being braced at the right time and having one of them hit me. Yep, cheers Nathan, that was you. And I'm not somebody who thinks that it's that difficult necessarily to knock somebody out. So if you're using the hello kind of elbow squaring off anyway, you've got a lot of opportunities probably. But it's just one other thing you can do. You just try to get a nice square hit in the punch. Yes, you do want to push the punch because you want to have maximum impact on the rib cage, and that's what's happening. That's what's giving a bit of a shock to the heart. We saw this in the world of online martial arts recently with Jesse Ankamp. In case you don't know, he concentrates on karate, and he had a fairly rough spar with Eddie Hall, and Eddie Hall was surprised. I personally think if they were fighting, if it was out and out combat, Eddie Hall would pick him up and throw him on the ground very hard, and that would be it. But it was a side kick. Jesse Ankamp got into the chest, and he called him a few choice words, and Idaho said that it felt like his heart skipped a beat. Not surprised, that's the kind of thing that will happen, and it will put you in some danger. If adrenaline was running, it wouldn't have stopped him for long, I'm quite sure about that. Anyway, right in the chest now. If they're not face onto you, then you probably want to step in, and again, if you're fainting, they might come to defend, and they might defend low. Not many people do this in defence. Not normally thought of as much of a target area. You probably want to go for the head. I would suggest here, probably a couple, finishing with a right, and then a good hook to the chest. And that's going to have an effect on them. You really want heavy impact there. Otherwise, it's just going to hit the sternum, which is pretty tough. Don't think you're at much risk of damage unless you get it in a really bad position. I am, as people will know if they watch many of my videos, perfectly fond of hitting with this part of the hand as well as this part of the hand, but you probably don't want to catch it without your knuckles bearing the brunt of the impact, whichever part they are. Also bears consideration, of course, elbow, and you can really put your weight into that in a way you can't. And sometimes I'm prone to think that if you're close in combat, you've got to have a good reason, unless the rules prohibit you from using elbows, to use hooks rather than elbows a lot of the time. That's going to give somebody pause for thought, quite sure of it. And last of all, actually I haven't really demonstrated the idea that you want to really step in if they do have the standard stance and the chest isn't really facing you. And of course, last of all, another thing worth doing, I'm not much of a kicker to the side, but I can kick very easily to head height to the front. Some people can't, and sometimes the further up you go, definitely the more power you're going to lose, but perhaps the more vulnerable you become. And another good option may well be, if you're moving around in the right way, I've got things like the camera stand right here stopping me from moving very much, but nice and easy. Always setting up with feints at the very least, and then a nice square kick to the chest. That's going to have quite an effect on them. And that's it for this one. Nice and quick. It just struck me the other day that although I saw this talked about the very first time I went to train in Muay Thai, I haven't heard much of it ever since then. Only reference to chest punches I've seen on YouTube is in punching towards the centre in case you keep on missing the head. And I just thought it's worth mentioning. Fairly short video. I've planned to make so many videos and I barely even, excuse me, just had lunch, barely even get the daylight. And now I finally got the daylight. It's raining quite heavily, so there's probably drops all over the window. Got many things coming, and I really just have to fit my schedule in. I've been working harder. I've been squeezing my ordinary lifting schedule into fewer days, making it more frequent, which is effective. It's working pretty well. I would sometimes take a day off, because if I'm making a half hour, 40-minute video, then you got 20 minutes preparation, 20 minutes afterwards, half hour or longer of editing, and it takes up a lot of time, and it was really throwing off my schedule. Now I'm learning to fit in making videos and training as hard as I want to at the same time, and I'm already lacking in martial arts training because of the lifting schedule. There's only so much you can do, only so many hours in a day. That's it then, just on the 13-minute mark. Thanks for watching. My name's Mark, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.